The savages had hacked holes in the roof and shot them down from above, and the floor was littered with arrow shafts where they'd snapped them off to get the clothes from the bodies. The altars had been hauled down and the tabernacle looted, and the great sleeping god of the Mexicans routed from his golden cup. The primitive painted saints in their frames hung cocked on the walls, as if an earthquake had visited, and a dead Christ in a glass beer lay broken in the chancel floor. The murdered lay in a great pool of their communal blood. It had set up into a sort of pudding, crossed everywhere with the tracks of wolves or dogs, and along the edges it had dried and cracked into a burgundy ceramic. Blood lay in dark tongues on the floor, and blood grouted the flagstones, and it ran in the vestibule where the stones were cupped from the feet of the faithful and their fathers before them, and it had threaded its way down the steps and dripped from the stones among the dark red tracks of the scavengers. Sproul turned and looked at the kid as if he'd know his thoughts, but the kid just shook his head. Flies clambered over the peeled and wigless skulls of the dead, and flies walked on their shrunken eyeballs. "Come on," said the kid. They crossed the square in the last of the light and went down the narrow street. In the doorway there lay a dead child with 2 buzzards sitting on it. Sproul shooed his good hand at the buzzards, and they baited and hissed and flapped clumsily, but they did not fly. They set forth in the morning with first light, while wolves slank from the doorways and dissolved in the fog of the streets. They went by the southwest road the way the savages had come. A little sandy stream, cottonwoods, 3 white goats. They waded a ford where women lay dead at their wash. They struggled all day across a terra damnata of smoking slag, passing from time to time the bloated shapes of dead mules or horses. By evening they had drunk all the water they carried. They slept in the sand and woke in the cool early morning dark, and went on, and they walked the cinderland till they were near to fainting. In the afternoon they came upon a carreta in the trace, tilted on its tongue, the great wheels cut from rounds of a cottonwood trunk and pinned to the axle trees with tenons. They crawled under it for shade and slept until dark and went on. The rind of a moon that had been in the sky all day was gone, and they followed the trail through the desert by starlight, the Pleiades straight overhead and very small, and the Great Bear walking the mountains to the north. "My arm stinks," said Sproul. "What?" "I said my arm stinks." "You want me to look at it?" "What for? You can't do nothing for it." "Well, you suit yourself." "I aim to," said Sproul. They went on. Twice in the night they heard the little prairie vipers rattle among the scrub, and they were afraid. With the dawn they were climbing among shale and whinstone under the wall of a dark monocline where turrets stood like basalt prophets. And they passed by the side of the road little wooden crosses propped in cairns of stone where travelers had met with death. The road winding up among the hills, and the castaways laboring upon the switchbacks, blackening under the sun, their eyeballs inflamed, and the painted spectra racing out at the corners. Climbing up through Ocotillo and Prickly Pear, where the rocks trembled and sleared in the sun. Rock and no water, and the sandy trace, and they kept watch for any green thing that might tell of water, but there was no water. They ate pignoli from a bag with their fingers and went on. Through the noon heat and into the dusk, where lizards lay with their leather chins flat to the cooling rocks, and fended off the world with thin smiles and eyes like cracked stone plates. They crested the mountain at sunset, and they could see for miles. An immense lake lay below them, with the distant blue mountains standing in the windless span of water, in the shape of a soaring hawk and trees that shimmered in the heat, and a distant city, very white against the blue and shaded hills. They sat and watched. They saw the sun drop under the jagged rim of the earth to the west, and they saw it flare behind the mountains, and they saw the face of the lake darken and the shape of the city dissolve upon it. They slept among the rocks face up like dead men, and in the morning when they rose, there was no city, and no trees, and no lake, only a barren, dusty plain. Sproul groaned and collapsed back among the rocks. The kid looked at him. There were blisters along his lower lip, and his arm through the ripped shirt was swollen, and something foul had seeped through among the darker bloodstains. He turned back and looked out over the valley. "Yonder comes somebody," he said. Sproul didn't answer. The kid looked at him. "I ain't lying," he said. "Indians," said Sproul. "Ain't it?" "I don't know. Too far to tell." "What are you aimed to do?" "I don't know." "What happened to the lake?" "I couldn't tell you." "We both saw it." "People see what they want to see." "Then how come I ain't seeing it now? I sure as hell want to." The kid looked out over the plain below. "What if it's Indians?" said Sproul. "Likely it will be." "Where can we hide at?" The kid spat dryly and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. A lizard came out from under a rock and crouched on its small cocked elbows over that piece of froth and drank it dry and returned to the rock again, leaving only a faint spot in the sand, which vanished almost instantly. They waited all day. The kid made sorties down into the canyons in search of water, but he found none. Nothing moved in that purgatorial waste save carnivorous birds. By early afternoon, they could see the horsemen on the switchbacks coming up the face of the mountain below them. They were Mexicans. Sproul was sitting with his legs outstretched before him. "I was worried about my old boots lasting me," he said. He looked up. "Go on," he said. "Save yourself." He waved his hand. They were laid up under a ledge of rock in a narrow shade. The kid didn't answer. Within the hour, they could hear the dry scrabble of hooves among the rocks and the clank of gear. The first horse to round the point of rock and pass through the gap in the mountain was the captain's big bay, and he carried the captain's saddle, but he did not carry the captain. The refugees stood by the side of the road. The riders looked burnt and haggard coming up out of the sun, and they sat their horses as if they had no weight at all. There were 7 of them, 8 of them. They wore broad-brimmed hats and leather vests, and they carried escopetas across the pommels of their saddles. And as they rode past, the leader nodded gravely to them from the captain's horse and touched his hat brim, and they rode on. Sproul and the kid looked after them. The kid called out, and Sproul had started to trot clumsily along behind the horses. The riders began to slump and reel like drunks. Their heads lolled. Their guffaws echoed among the rocks, and they turned their mounts and sat them and regarded the wanderers with huge grins. "Que quiere?" cried the leader. The riders cackled and slapped at one another. They had nudged their horses forward, and they began to ride them about without aim. The leader turned to the 2 afoot. "Buscan a los indios." With this, some of the men dismounted and fell to hugging one another and weeping shamelessly. The leader looked at them and grinned, his teeth white and massive, made for foraging. "Loonies," said Sproul. "They're loonies." The kid looked up at the leader. "How about a drink of water?" he said. The leader sobered. He pulled a long face. "Water?" he said. "We ain't got no water," said Sproul. "But my friend, how no? It's very dry here. He reached behind him without turning, and a leather canteen was passed across the riders to his hand. He shook it and offered it down. The kid pulled the stopper and drank, and stood panting and drank again. The leader reached down and tapped the canteen. "Basta," he said. He hung on, gulping. He couldn't see the horseman's face darken. The man shoved one boot backward out of the stirrup and kicked the canteen cleanly from between the kid's hands, leaving him there for a moment in a frozen gesture of calling, with the canteen rising and turning in the air and the lobes of water gleaming about it in the sun before it clattered to the rocks. Sproul scrambled after it and snatched it up where it lay, draining, and began to drink, watching over the rim. The horseman and the kid watched each other. Sproul sat back, gasping and coughing. The kid stepped across the rocks and took the canteen from him. The leader kneed his horse forward and drew a sword from its place beneath his leg, and leaning forward, ran the blade under the strap and raised it up. The point of the blade was about 3 inches from the kid's face, and the canteen strap was draped across the flat of it. The kid had stopped, and the rider raised the canteen gently from his hands and let it slide down the blade and come to rest at his side. He turned to the men and smiled, and they once again began to hoot and to pummel one another like apes. He swung the stopper up from where it hung by a thong and drove it home with the heel of his hand. He pitched the canteen to the man behind him and looked down at the travelers. "Why you no hide?" he said. "From you?" "From I. We were thirsty. Very thirsty, eh?" They didn't answer. He was tapping the flat of the sword lightly against the horn of his saddle, and he seemed to be forming words in his mind. He leaned slightly to them. "When the lambs is lost in the mountain," he said, "they is cry. Sometime come the mother, sometime the wolf." He smiled at them and raised the sword and ran it back where it had come from, and turned the horse smartly and trotted it through the horses behind him. And the men mounted up and followed, and soon all were gone. Sproul sat without moving. The kid